So today is another one of the lectures on like good coding practices. Today should be the last one because between the clean coding, what else have we done? We talked about test-driven development, right? We talked about version control, and we talked about debugging. And now today we're going to talk about incremental development. So incremental development is used in the industry along with version control and test-driven development. So I think with all of these things, if you just keep practicing them, we also talked about testing, right, with the test-driven development. So if you just keep practicing all of those, you'll get better and better at it, and it will make you better programmers. And it also helps just like by knowing how to program, you can apply that to other phases in your life as well. So incremental development, what do we think incremental development is? The name itself says a lot.
You develop one key part of the program at a time.
So work on small parts to make up whole program. Right? So if we were working on small parts to make up the whole program, what do we think maybe the first step would be if we're like the homework, if you're given a function to make? What should you start doing?
Variables.
So part of it is going to be what are the parameters for the function, right? So that goes along with defining the function. And then after you've defined the function, it's empty at first, right? If you follow test-driven development, you would further define what is the behavior of the function by writing those tests. And then making sure that they fail because you have no implementation. Okay? So then after you've written your test and made sure that they failed, what do you think is the next step?
Could split up the function into different parts.
Okay. Right? So split it up into smaller parts if you think that's appropriate. And then again, we would write tests for those smaller parts. But then let's assume we're at like what we think is a good, it's only going to be a maximum 10 lines function. We need to start coding it. Am I going to write it all at once? The 10 lines? Yes? No? Incremental development. What do you think I should add first? So we should try and approach it in like this algorithmic way. So let's say first we'll add control flow. So like what are any if statements? Loops. What are all these things that I'm going to need in terms of control for this function? Let me add those first so that I'm incrementally modifying the code. And then make sure they work, right? Before moving on. Before you move to the next incremental step, verify that the first incremental step gives you the behavior that you want, right? Then the next thing you can do is add functional components. So like inside your for loop, if you're checking something, or if you're adding to an array, multiplying, those are that's your functional code. Okay? And then one thing to keep in mind for both of these, one at a time. I'm not going to write 3 separate loops, 3 separate if statements, unless they're connected, like if-else statements with else if or case statements. I'm just going to do one thing at a time, very incrementally, right? And then after all this, we test, and then incrementally debug, right? So why do we want to do incremental development? What do we think are some of the advantages?
There's an error, then you know where it is.
Yeah, so let's put maybe over here. So pages. So let's say small snippets of code to search for errors, right? Because we're hardly changing the code in between, right? What else? There's something else like along this same line of errors. What am I doing after I'm adding the if statements? We're making sure they're working, right? And then we go on to adding the control, not the control, the functional parts, and then we make sure those are working, rather than adding everything all at once and then finding the error later. So by doing incremental development, we're also finding errors earlier. Right? And it kind of goes along with the test-driven developments. Because you're writing your code, test, right? Test. Or finding those errors very early. So we see why we want to do incremental development. Right? Okay. Keep these. This is what we came up with. And I have, your code is 047. That's, I have this. So a few things that can help you with incremental development is, we talked about GitHub last time with version control, right? So if you have a GitHub repository, one thing that you can do when you find any errors or bugs in your code and you are not going to address it right then, you can use this feature called issues. So you can create like this task, describe what the bug is, where in the code that this bug is occurring and needs to be fixed. And then anyone else that has access to the repository can go look through the issues and pick one to start working on. So it helps with this incremental development. Yes.
Are we going to be using GitHub to like submit last week's lab?
So on Gradescope, you're just sending me the zip file with all of your code. You should be using GitHub just to keep getting practice with it and getting familiar with it. And you should use it for not just this class, everything. And you don't have to use GitHub, but there's also Bitbucket, there's GitLabs, but you should be learning some form of version control. And most of them are using Git as the version control software part. Because when you go into industry, you're not going to find anywhere that is not using version control. You're going to need to be familiar with it because that's the only way that you're going to work in teams of anything more than one person. Right? So another feature of GitHub that can be beneficial with the incremental developments are GitHub branches. So one thing that you might do with these branches is, I'm working on this specific feature. I'm going to create a branch that is adding that feature that is separate from the main branch. So like over here, this is the first commit, this is the second commit, and then here I've decided I'm going to work on this feature. So I'm not going to mess with the main branch. I'm going to work on it on my own over here or with my small team of like 3, maybe 4 people. And we're going to implement that feature, and then we'll merge back with the main branch once our feature is done. So in this way, you stay disconnected from the main branch, and maybe this commit 3 is some other team merging their branch that has their feature that's done with the main branch. So then the main branch can kind of be like this production branch that is clean and doesn't have any of the incremental features that are not done in it. So this is where you're going to do your incremental development on a separate branch. So few items. You can check out branches, you can create branches, but then once you want to kind of get rid of a branch by merging it with the main or with a separate branch, because Git supports multiple branches, like you can branch off of a different branch, and then you can merge with that branch before you merge back to the main branch. But when you're merging, you are going to have to figure out if there's any conflicts. So just like when you're committing and it's telling you to fix those conflicts, when you merge branches, you will also fix any conflicts. So another thing that you can use, this is specific to GitHub, but other version control, centralized version control software also supports something very similar, but you can fork. So this is going to create a complete copy of some other repository that you do not own that you can now edit that will not impact the other repository. So it's similar to branching, but rather than branching off of the main branch, it's just creating a whole copy that you can edit. So this is useful for working mostly on like open source software that is available and anyone is able to contribute to. So the way that you contribute to those open source software is you fork, you create your own repository, and then if you have something that you think maybe you've resolved one of the issues on that repository, what you can then do is make a pull request. So that's where you're requesting that the original repository owner takes this version of the code that you've contributed to and adds it to that main repository. So that's one of the main ways that this is used. The other way is just starting from a different project and you want to incrementally add on to it, change it for your own use. So do we understand the difference between a fork and a branch? So again, these are features that I would encourage you to not just understand from the lecture, but get hands-on experience with. Start using them. Because the earlier you learn this, the earlier you get familiar with it, the easier working on larger projects, working with teams is going to be in the future. And then this is our incremental development slide, right? So the strategy is to incrementally write the program's code from a few lines to minimize errors and avoid debugging a lot of code, like looking for bugs in a larger code base. So like we talked about, we start from writing short snippets, add a few lines at each step, and then keep working every time you modify the code. Make sure that it's still working. Don't just write the small snippet and not check it, and then write this next small snippet. What we want to avoid is writing an entire code base at once and then testing it all at once. Because then maybe you have multiple errors and you're not sure where to start looking for those errors. It's ultimately most likely going to take you more time to debug and maybe even when you're trying to add more features later on. So it is a little bit extra time to do all of the steps that we talked about, right? But most likely it's better than trying to deal with this. And this is for sure the case for larger projects. Like maybe you can make the argument that's for the smaller projects, like what you work on in maybe this class. The code base is really small. But I would still encourage you to start working with this practice, even though it's a smaller code base, just to get familiar with it before you go into much larger projects where it's absolutely necessary. And now it's like the first time you're doing it. And these were the advantages we talked about. Aware of flaws earlier and able to figure out exactly which part the bug came from, because there's only a few lines that you've added since the last time you tested. And like I talked about, you can use test-driven developments, and we've already covered this. So then here is just a couple of steps that you can use for incremental developments. We also covered this a little. So scaffolding, so that's like just defining the function, right? And then validating that all the parameters that you've put in the defined function is everything that you need, right? And then adding those control flow statements, and then completing the function would be adding the functional parts of the code. So there's a few steps that you can follow, and you're incrementally doing this. So in between each of these steps, you are testing to make sure that's exactly what you added is doing exactly what you thought it was going to do when you added. Okay. So that's all I have on incremental developments. Do we have any questions on any of these things? We're going to practice with incremental development. We've been practicing, I know we've been practicing the test cases because I can see that you've been submitting those. But have we been using GitHub? So start using GitHub, start using incremental developments. Play around with GitHub issues. Like you're already working in teams, right? So after you found a bug, open an issue on GitHub so everyone on the team can see what the bug is, and then you can also resolve the issue on GitHub when you fixed it. Okay. So that will be it for this.